We're going to go ahead and continue with notes for homework 13 and 14. This is part B. So we're going to pick up right where we left off, where we're just talking about a cluster, which deals with subgroups, but within the subgroups that are selected, everybody is surveyed. Let's talk about a few more things that have to do with that. Voluntary response bias. It's kind of like what it sounds like. A sampling bias that often occurs when the samples are volunteers. For example, volunteers want their views to be heard. So it may be a certain kind of person that's really feels strongly about something. They're going to be the ones that would volunteer for that. Maybe it's somebody that really has more time, that isn't as busy as somebody else. But that's voluntary response bias that can occur. It just means that the people that end up volunteering, they may not represent the population of the sample in the best way, because certain type of person might be volunteer. Okay. Self-interest study. That's a sampling bias that occurs when the researchers have an interest in the outcome. So look at this example. What they mean by that is that the researchers are not completely independent. They may have a connection somehow to the experiment that's being done. So right here, a study done by Wrigley Science Institute, a branch of Wrigley Chewing Gum Company, found that chewing gum may raise math grades in teenagers. So right there, that's self-interest. That's a self-interest study. Wrigley Gum might have said, "Hey, let's get this research done, and maybe it'll prove something cool about chewing gum, and more people will chew it." Now even if they don't out and out try to influence it, which they usually maybe wouldn't do that, but a sampling bias occurs when the researchers have an interest, because they may even be like, "Oh, here, do this math thing. Let's see what happens." Or maybe, "Don't you like this kind of gum better than the other?" Or like with Pepsi versus Coke. I told you the Pepsi challenge. Well, Pepsi was the one that came up with that. So when they're asking people, they may be like, "Oh, don't you like this one better? Isn't this one good right over here?" Because they're wanting it to come out that way. So that's a kind of a self-interest study or a bias that can occur that way. A response bias, that is a sampling bias where the responder gives inaccurate responses. The responder is being asked the questions. Like, "Here, I'd like for you to take the survey, please." And okay, and then you ask them questions, and then the person gives the wrong answers or the wrong responses. So in other words, if a survey asks people something like this: "When was the last time you visited the doctor?" Many people may not remember exactly when they saw the doctor and give inaccurate responses. So they don't really mean to. It's just that it may be asking them something that's kind of like way out there, and they don't remember exactly when something happened or something like that. That's called response bias. So the responses may not be accurate. These are all biases. So we got response bias, self-interest study, that's a bias, and volunteer response bias. So let me write that down. You may want to kind of pencil that in. The 3 different kinds of bias. Oh, there's more. Number 4. I forgot about this one. Okay. Perceived lack of, I always will say this wrong. It's like being anonymous. Anonymity. A sampling bias where the responder fears giving an honest answer because his or her response may have a negative effect. So it could be like if maybe you took a sample of maybe some people that are going to a doctor or something in a particular doctor's office, and you were trying to get a sample of some kids there, and maybe one of the questions had to do with, have you ever smoked before? And the kid's like, heck, I'm not going to answer that the right way because my mom may hear me say that I smoked, and she doesn't know about it. So it's like trying to be anonymous, like perceived lack of it can be a problem. A sampling bias where the responder's person answering the questions, fears giving an honest answer because his or her response might have a negative effect. An employer puts out a survey asking their employees if they have a drug abuse problem and need treatment help. Answering truthfully might have consequences. Responses might not be accurate if the employees do not feel their responses are anonymous or fear retribution from their employee. They may think that, oh man, they're just trying to find out if I've had a drug abuse problem before. I'm not going to tell them that I've had a problem, but it was years ago and I'm over it now. But they or they even say they need treatment. Like, yeah, I'm doing good now, but I probably could use some help with it. They may not want to admit that because they may be like, that's a trap. They're gonna fire me. They're gonna find out that I have a drug abuse problem, so they may not be honest. Loaded questions. So loaded questions is kind of like what it sounds like. When the question wording influences the responses. A survey asks, do you support funding research of alternative energy sources to reduce our reliance on high-polluting fossil fuels? So they're leading right here. So obviously this person is leading them to be like, yeah, I support funding for that because we don't want that high-polluting stuff. Well, fossil fuel... So they're kind of leading them into answering the way they want them to, because they're acting like, oh, this will support research to kind of reduce something really negative. They're making it seem very negative. Okay, so non-response bias, a sampling bias where people refuse to participate in the study. So non-response, there's nobody that's responding to it. A telephone poll asks the question, do you often have time to relax and read a book? And 50% of the people called refused to answer the survey. When people refuse to participate, we can no longer be certain, that should say no longer. We can no longer be certain that our sample is representative of the population. So let's say you had done some sort of sampling where you took out certain groups and you made sure it was representative of everything, and then half the people that you thought were going to do it don't respond. So then you got a problem. And that's one thing that's really important when you do these studies is you want to be as sure as you can that your sample is representative of the population. Okay, in each situation, identify a potential source of bias. So there's 6 of them. A survey asks how many sexual partners a person has had in the last year. Now, that is kind of an embarrassing thing. Someone might say, well, I've had a year where, yeah, I've had like 52. I mean, one a week. Somebody different every week. Some people are like, I'm not going to say that. That may not sound good. So that one was what? Let me see. Response bias or self-interest. I think it's response bias. Because it says here, a sampling bias where the responder gives inaccurate responses. Well, that may not be it. They may not know the answer, or is there one about being, oh, right here. I think it's more this one. Perceived lack of anonymity or something like that. I can't even say it. It's like being anonymous. Lack of being anonymous, okay? Sampling bias where the responder fears giving an honest answer because his or her response might have a negative effect. Like being asked about the drug abuse problem. So, let's see. But that one is almost a fear of an honest answer because it might have a negative effect. Like you fear you might lose your job over it. You're not going to lose your job if you admit to something like this. So I'm thinking that this might be response bias. They're not going to remember. Well, some people would remember. I could say honestly, one. I've been married forever. So, but anyway, maybe if you're asking a certain group of people that maybe they're not going to remember. But what's interesting is this is response bias because men sometimes overreport. They brag about, oh yeah, I've had. Well, they say it more. Sometimes over-report. Where women are more like, man, I'm not going to admit, how many sexual partners I've had in the last year. Women tend to underreport. Oops. Underreport just means that give you a number that's less than what it actually is, where men would overreport more. Okay, radio station asks readers to phone in their choice in a daily poll. What would that one be? Well, it's going to be voluntary bias, because remember, that's just going to be volunteers. Anybody that wants to call in can. So what do we call that when you volunteer? Or how are they selected? How would they select the people that are going to do this? Well, this is volunteer bias because, this sample is self-selected. So that's volunteer bias because you may only get a certain type of person or, in there to answer them. So that's volunteer bias. High school students are asked if they have consumed alcohol in the last 2 weeks. That's something they may not want to admit. So that's the one where they want to stay anonymous when it comes to like that. They don't want to get it back to their parents or something like that. Lack of the anonymity. Lack of being anonymous. And one reason why they may want to stay anonymous in this case is they're underage. So maybe they're like, man, if I admit this in this survey, the cops are going to come and arrest me for drinking underage or something. Okay, so the Beef Council releases a study stating that consuming red meat poses little cardiovascular risk. So the Beef Council. So that represents the beef industry, or the farms and ranches and stuff that deal with that. So the Beef Council, whether it be cows or pigs or whatever, that wouldn't be pigs. Pigs are pork, but Beef Council, they're interested in clearing, the big stigma about red meat, about how it causes all kind of cardiovascular problems. They want to clear that. So what bias is that going to be? That one's a self-interest study. Self-interest study. Okay, so the reason that's a self-interest study is the Beef Council they really want a good study result. So that can influence what happens if they feel that strongly. So that's called self-interest. A poll asked, do you support the new transportation tax, or would you prefer to see our public transportation system fall apart? There's one about guilting you into it. But there is one. Loaded question, maybe. Do you suppose a new transportation law? Would you support a new transportation law, or would you prefer to see our transportation system fall apart? They're kind of, that's a leading question. If somebody asks you that, you can tell they want you to say, oh, the new transportation tax. I support that. I wouldn't prefer the whole system to fall apart. So they're kind of, that's a leading question. And the reason is, and on some of these on the test, you're going to be writing out, why you're answering a certain way. So in the survey or the study, okay, within the study, it is implying that if you do not prefer public transportation, then it will fall apart. So, observational study, that's the next thing we're going to talk about. It's a study based on observations or measurements. An experiment is a study in which the effects of a treatment are measured. So observational studies is based on observation or measurements. So sometimes it might be that they want to look up some stuff that happened 20, 30 years ago at San Jack, maybe, how many students had certain classes or made certain grades in certain classes or something like that. They can just kind of observe it. They can pull up the information previously and just look at it that way. Or they could have it where they set up something and watch and see what people do. My older son took a psychology type class in high school, and he actually was homeschooled, but he took classes at different places, and he loved that class. They got to go on a couple of field trips, and one of them they went to Baybrook Mall, and at one point they would just stand and just look at something, just looking. And he said it was amazing how many people would stop and kind of look like, oh, like even acted like they could see whatever it was. Or they would kind of see how many people would, if there was, they would kind of like glue, not really glue, but somehow glue like a quarter down or something like that. I don't know. And then and see how many people would actually stop to try to pick it up. And of course, you don't do these things at all. I think they had cleared all this with the people at the mall before they did any of this stuff. But just to kind of observe what people do in certain situations. Or it can be looking back at things in the past that have been recorded, measurements. They can look at anything that's happened in the past as well. An experiment is a study in which the effects of the treatment are measured. So there's actually a treatment. It's applied to the subject of the experiment for a duration and then measured during the course of the treatment. So that would be actually testing something. Now, sometimes you have to do observational study because you can't do an experiment. And an example of that would be if you wanted to look at the effects of seatbelts, whether they save lives or not. You can't really do a full-on experiment where you have a treatment group, a group that's going to have the seatbelts on, and not let people in this other group wear seatbelts. That may be kind of dangerous. So what you can do is, for an observational study, you can go back and look at the data. You can look at the records and how many people, how many people wore their seatbelts or something like that, and had a wreck or something. I don't know. But so you really couldn't do an experiment at that point because you wouldn't want to have a group that had the seatbelt and not let the other group not have it. And a treatment is applied to the subject of the experiment for duration and then measured through the course of the treatment. Determine which of the scenarios below describes an observational study and which describe an experiment. The weights of 30 randomly selected people are measured. So that's really just measuring, that's really coming up with the weights. So that's really observational. Subjects are asked to do 20 jumping jacks and then their heart rates are measured. Okay. So what do y'all think about that one? Okay, since they're just looking at measuring the weights only, They're just observing that data. They're measuring the weights. Okay. Subjects are asked to do 20 jumping jacks, and then their heart rates are measured. This is actually an experiment. This is an experiment. So what they could do, they're going to have a group that's going to be where the treatment is the jumping jacks. Okay, so the experiment, that's when you could have the what the treatment is. Jumping jacks. The treatment is the treatment in. Okay. 20 people are given a concentration test after drinking a cup of coffee. That's an experiment. And what is the treatment? Treatment is drinking coffee. Confounding occurs when there's two potential variables that could have caused the outcome, and it's not possible to determine which actually caused it. Okay, an example is, right here, let me write on this first. There's two potential variables that could have caused the outcome, and it's not possible to determine which one caused the result. A drug company claims people lost an average of 8 pounds while taking a weight loss pill. What could be some other variables that cause the weight loss? Is it compounding? Why or why not? So some things that cause some other variables that cause the weight loss. Other variables. Diet and exercise. Diet and exercising. Okay. Let me see. Is it confounding? Yes. Okay, so because it is not clear if the weight loss is due to the pill or other variables. If weight loss is due to the pill or other Variables. Variables. Oops. Now, participants in an experiment are divided into two or more groups. There's a control group that does not receive the treatment. The treatment group receives the treatment being tested. So, let's just move on. Okay, treatment group receives the treatment being tested. Placebo is a dummy treatment given to the control group for the placebo effect, the effect of a treatment influenced by the patient's perspective. An experiment that tells you the control group's a placebo is called a placebo-controlled environment. In a blind study, the participant is not informed whether he or she received the treatment of the placebo. Double-blind, all participants, including researchers and the subject, are not informed within subjects in the treatment group and in the control group. And that's it. Oh, there is another example down here. To test a new lie detector, I need to move something out of the way on the screen. Okay. One group is asked to answer all the questions truthfully. The second group is asked to lie for one of the other professors. The person administrating the lie detector does not know what group he started each subject in. Does the experiment have a control group? Is it blind, double-blind, or neither? Okay, I think that's it. So we've now gone through 13 and 14. So you'll be able to do the homework for those two sections.